but I don't have the strong voice that you have. So I have to stay here. So I assume I was introduced this morning in my absence. I'll get to talk to you a little bit more about what I do, I hope later on. I apologize for being late, but Justin's office had me on doing a workshop yesterday until 8 o'clock at night in San Diego. So I needed some sleep before I got here this morning. So today I was asked to talk about false confessions. And so part of my talk is to talk about how false confessions can occur, an important topic. But I also want to end, and I hope I have time, to end talking about the new research that psychologists are conducting to improve the reliability of the information that is obtained from suspects, and in that process reduce the probability of obtaining false confessions. Because part of what we want to do, right, as scientists, is not only to point out the issues and understand why those issues occur, but also provide solutions. And that's what this research is going in psychology and social science in general, to look at ways that we can reduce the probability of false confessions and improve the possibility of improve the quality of information that we obtain from suspects. And in that process, help law enforcement do their job. So what I'd like to do is, like the other speakers, show you a video. But I'd like you first to imagine yourselves in participating in a psychological experiment. And you as the participant, you go into the lab and you are told that you're going to participate in a study which is looking at the effects of punishment on learning. And you by random assignment, you become the teacher. And your job is to teach some materials to the participant in another room. And this participant is supposed to learn, is the learner, supposed to learn this material. And as you teach this material, if the learner does not learn the material, you're supposed to deliver some punishment to this learner. And the punishment is electric shocks, okay? So if the learner doesn't learn, you're supposed to increase the intensity of these electric shocks, okay? And so you're good because you're going to do a great job teaching this material, right? And you hope that this learner is going to learn, so you don't have to punish them, right? But what happens if the learner doesn't learn and is making mistakes all the time, and your job is to deliver those shocks, those electric shocks, and you're supposed to increase the intensity? What would you do? What would you say? Would you do it? Most people would say, no way I would do that. I'm not going to deliver electric shocks to another person, no way. I will walk away. Unless they're putting a gun to my head, right? Maybe I will do that. But no way I will act that way. Let's see what this is a real study. For those of you who are familiar with this study, you'll see this will be familiar. So let's see what this participant does.
Axe, needle, stick, blade. Answer, please. Wrong. I'm up to 180 volts.
Please continue, teacher.
Needle, you're gonna get a shock. 180 volts.
I can't stand the pain. Let me out of
You
here.
can't stand it. I'm not gonna kill that man, eh? I mean, who's gonna take the responsibility if anything happens to that gentleman?
I'm responsible for anything that happens here. Continue, please.
You accept all the responsibility?
The responsibility is mine, correct. Please go on.
Gold, dollar, necklace, moon, paint. Answer, please. Are you all right? 405 volts. The answer is moon.
Let me out of here. Let me out of here. My heart's bothering me. Let
Actually.
me out, I tell you. Let me out. Let me out of here. You have no right to hold me here. Let me out. Let me out. Let me out.
Excellent. Fast.
Let me out. Let me out.
Bird, car, train, plane.
Go on, please, with the procedure.
Please answer. 450 volts. That's it.
Now continue using the last switch on the board, please, the 450 switch for each wrong answer. Continue, please.
I'm not getting no answer.
Please continue. The next word is white.
You think you should look in on him, please?
Not once we've started the
But
experiment.
what if something's happened to the man having attacked or something there?
The experiment requires that we continue. Go on, please.
Don't the man's health mean anything?
Whether the learner likes it or not, we
But
must...
he might be dead in there.
Familiar with the study? Some of you? Yeah, some of the students? Those are the famous Milgram studies conducted back in the 50s and 60s and have been replicated in different forms over the years. What does the Milgram study tell us? It tells us that people that are intelligent, otherwise psychologically healthy, can be induced to comply by the situational forces, including authority figures, right? To do things like deliver shocks, electric shocks to another human being. And in some of the conditions in this study, almost the majority of people went all the way to the 450 volts and delivered those shocks, right? And so this is, tells us that these shocking behaviors that is inconsistent with common sense is the kinds of things that we're talking about when we're talking about false confessions. Most people would not believe that they themselves would ever falsely confess to a crime that they didn't commit. No way, unless they're putting a gun to your head, right? But the psychological processes, the situational forces that induces people to do things against their better judgment, against the self-interest, we've known for a long time. Psychological science has a lot to say about that. And so I want you to think about that as I present some of the main studies. To think that I'll point to some studies that tells us about the process of false confessions, but there's a whole literature in psychology, developmental psychology, cognitive psychology, social psychology, the psychology of influence that informs on these issues. We know it is possible for people to falsely confess to crimes they didn't commit, and the situational forces can be very powerful. Okay, so to understand false confessions, we have to talk about the interrogation. What we're talking about here with the exoneration cases, it's mainly we're talking about interrogation-induced false confessions. There are other categories of false confessions, but these are the topic of today. And also the kinds of situations that we can do something about, right? So we can change the process of interrogation to reduce the chances of eliciting false confessions and improve the reliability of the information that is obtained from suspects. So to understand, we have to talk about a little bit about the process of interrogation. And the process of interrogation in the United States is what we call, the approach that is used in the United States mainly is what is called an accusatory approach to interrogation. It's a confrontational accusatory approach, and this is to distinguish from other types of approaches in other countries in Europe that are more information gathering interviews. In fact, in some countries they don't use interrogation. It's only investigative interviewing. So in the United States, it's an accusatory confrontational approach, and it's one category of those is what is called the Reid technique. Anybody familiar with the Reid technique? Some people, yes. Okay, the Reid technique is the main approach to interrogation. It was an approach that was developed back in the 30s and 40s as an alternative to torture tactics. So this is a psychologically based approach, and most detectives in the U.S., and I know that because we've conducted, scientists have conducted studies and we have analyzed many interrogations. Most detectives are trained in some way with the Reid technique, even if they don't know it. If they don't know that it's called the Reid technique, that is really what it's called. And so they either receive training from the company that is called Reid and Associates, or from other companies that use part of their approaches. So in some way or another, they're using the Reid technique, and it's easy. They're easy to spot on if you evaluate an interrogation. Okay, so what happens with the Reid technique? The Reid technique involves a very important critical step, right? Because not law enforcement wants to obtain a false confession. Most police officers don't want to obtain a false confession, right? So there's supposed to be some safeguards along the way to ensure that innocent people are eliminated from the process. And this critical decision is supposed to be the safeguard, one of the safeguards. That is the difference between an interview and an interrogation. I know most people talk about interrogation and they talk about interviews and they think it's the same thing. They're not the same thing, at least not with this approach. The pre-interrogation interview is an information gathering activity in which there's a reduction of the number of leading and suggestive questions. The idea is to gather information as much as possible from the suspect. Is that it involves, like they say, a 70-30 talking ratio, meaning 70% of the time the suspect should be talking, or suspect or witness, whoever the person of interest is, and 30% of the time the officer should be talking. Why? Because the officer is supposed to be asking key questions that are part of what is called the behavioral analysis interview, and these questions are supposed to elicit behaviors that are indicative of deception, of truth and deception. What are those behaviors primarily? Nonverbal, although they do talk about verbal behaviors like inconsistencies in what people are saying, but most of those behaviors that police officers are looking for are nonverbal. This approach involves looking for nonverbal behaviors. What are those? What you would expect, what people think liars do. What people think liars do? They look away. That's like number one. Worldwide, everybody thinks that, right? They look away. Or they're crossing their arms, right? Or crossing their legs. Or cleaning lint out of their shirt, right? Those are the nonverbal behaviors. And I'll talk about this. None of them are reliable indicators of deception, including the looking away. Although it's the stereotypical behavior, everybody thinks that it is indicative of deception. It is not a reliable cue. Okay, and based primarily on these assumptions about how the deceptive suspect looks and how the innocent person looks, based on primarily on these assumptions, sometimes there's evidence too, but primarily based on this, the person is moved to the next phase of the process, which is the interrogation. Now this is the pressure cooker. Now this is an interrogation. The interrogation involves a number of steps, the famous 9 steps of the Reed approach, which they're designed to move the suspect from denial to admission. Okay? There's a series of strategic steps, and now this changes. This is an accusatory confrontational activity with the goal primarily of moving the suspect from denial to admission. The idea here is that we already know that the suspect is guilty or deceptive because we made that assumption or that decision early on. Now this person is guilty. And there's problems with this part of the process is that there's not enough safeguards for the officer to think, well, maybe I should change my mind. Maybe this person might be actually innocent. At this point, most what happens is the whole process induces people to think that the person is guilty because supposedly that determination was done before. And what are there are a number of steps that I can't go over here, but I want to talk about 3 inferential strategies that sort of summarizes the approach. So interrogation is about control. At this point, is detective dominated. There's a 90-10% talking ratio. 90% of the time, the detective should be talking. 10% of the time, allow the detective to talk only the information that the detective wants to hear, right, about the crime. So interrogation, the first part of the process is control of the setting, the physical setting, as well as control of the timing of events, right? So Stephen talked about sleep deprivation. Sometimes these interrogations are in 9 o'clock at night or 5 o'clock in the morning, right? Police have control of when that interrogation is going to take place. All of us are familiar with interrogation rooms. They're designed to create what is called an unsupportive environment. It's usually a 10 by 10 room with no distraction. It's a private place where the police can talk to the suspect. No distractions, one table, 2 chairs, 2 or 3 chairs. And ideally, the suspect should not be put against the wall, away from the door. But in the interrogations that I evaluate, usually that's the case. I see the suspect against the wall, away from the door, and the police is in between the suspect and the door, right? This is a very strategic setting. And why is that? Well, the idea is to provide a private environment, a place where police is in control and the suspect knows that, and try to get them in a place that is unfamiliar. What happens when we're in an unfamiliar environment? We try to figure out how to get out of that situation, right? Figure out how can we deal with this. And so that's part of it. In this process, oh, by the way, and the chair is supposed to be a hardback chair, not a comfortable chair at all. Why is that? Part of this is because you don't want the suspect to gain psychological strength. Any little thing that helps us gain psychological strength in a familiar environment, in an unfamiliar environment, will allows us to resist, right? So these things are, the idea is to chop away psychological strength. Then we have the second influential strategy, which is control of the perception of the evidence against the suspect. And how do they control this? The control is to, well, they have to convince the suspect that the police has this mountain of evidence against them, right? If they do, they convince the suspect, then the suspect might start thinking, well, maybe I'll talk, right? And so how do they convince the suspect? They do this by continuously affirming guilt, by telling them they're guilty, that they know he's lying, he or she is lying. Cutting off denials. So if the suspect denies wrongdoing or tries to explain the situation or provide an alibi, that's supposed to be cut off. Remember, this time is detective dominated. The detective is supposed to be talking most of the time. And part of that is presenting evidence. Some of the evidence against the suspect is real, but most of the time is false. The police is allowed to present false evidence in this context. That is a legal tactic. It's called a ruse. Sometimes they just say, we have this DNA evidence that proved that you're guilty, or we have an eyewitness that pointed that you were the perpetrator. So sometimes they say that they have it, sometimes they say that they will have it, what is called a bluff, and sometimes they actually make it up. I just have a case right now from last month in which I found a letter from a lab saying that the DNA evidence matches the suspect, but actually that's a fake piece of paper. They just made it up to show it to the suspect. So all of these things are legal tactics. The last influential strategy that I like to point out is what is called presenting. So at this point, the denying is not an option, right? So the denials are being cut off at this point. For the innocent person, innocence is not, oh my goodness, 10 minutes, wow. Innocence is no longer an option. So at some point you have to provide some options, like Justin talked about, right? So which door do I go? And so the officers provide options, and these are called excuses, exculpatory scenarios. That one kind, which is the minimizing scenarios, downplays the seriousness of the offense, providing excuses. Things like, for example, if it's a rape case, it was not your fault, you're a guy, you're human, look at how she dressed, she came on to you. Those kinds of scenarios that minimizes the seriousness of the offense, right? In comparison to a maximized scenario, things like, well, are you a sexual predator? You intended to rape her. That's what you do, right? You're never going to get fixed. You're sick, right? And so which option do you think that the jury is going to, what do you think the jury is going to think? Or what do you think the judges are going to think? Or what do you think the DA is going to think? So eventually these options are there. Either I'm a sexual predator or I'm a human being who committed a mistake and she came on to me. Those kinds of scenarios, eventually one is more appealing than the other. And so what happens when innocence is no longer on the table and denial is no longer an option, right? So guilty people in that same situation, they will pick the one door, right? The better scenario. And if it's a good interrogation, then there will be another point where there's an elicitation of the full-on confession with details. Hopefully, the admission doesn't just involve the minimizing scenario, right? Because the minimizing scenario is what the police provided. That's not reliable. So hopefully there's more to that. Usually, in the problematic cases, we don't see much more of just presenting a confession that involves details that the police provided. So what does I only have a few minutes, but I'm going to go quickly talk about summarize the research on the pre-interrogation interview. Basically, what there's 3 lines of research that tell us that those cues that are being sought after during the pre-interrogation interview are not reliable cues, to detect deception. And specifically those that are involved in the behavior analysis interview, they don't seem to be useful in discriminating between truth tellers and liars, between guilty and innocent. And then just the general psychological literature in deception. There's tons of studies and meta-analysis, for those of you familiar with meta-analysis, which are studies of studies that show that we're not very good, human beings are not very good at discriminating between truth tellers and liars based on behavioral cues, okay? The overall average in one comprehensive analysis was 54% accuracy rate. 54% accuracy rate in detecting deception is not very impressive if you think that chance levels is 50%. Flip a coin, you will reach pretty much the same level as using behavioral cues. And the retraining specifically does not improve people's ability to detect deception, but it does increases their confidence in their ability. So it's a dangerous combination because it doesn't improve ability, but improves confidence, right? So remember that critical step. If you move the person to the interrogation room, they're confident that they did detect deception, right? Okay, the interrogation phase, I have a few studies. So I'll summarize because I only have a few minutes. Basically, the way that this research is done is looking at specific tactics, right? In the laboratory, we can look at specific tactics and determine, what is the probability that those tactics will lead to false confessions versus true confessions. And in some studies, what they looked at is how the training, the accusatory training, changes the expectations of the investigators. And once they change their expectations change to believe that a person is guilty, even when the person is innocent, it's very difficult for them to change that expectation. And they become inflexible in their thinking, and their conduct is a confirmatory process, right? To try to find clues to confirm their original theory. And what we find in research is, and this is just an example of one study, this is one study that is an example of this line of research, that when investigators were believed that suspects were guilty, when in fact some people were innocent, right? So the suspect is innocent, but they were led to believe that the suspects were innocent. They were more likely to use pressure tactics, to believe that they're all guilty, and to use more leading questions, and those questions assume guilt. But my favorite part of this study is to look at this bar. And I don't have to explain all the parts of this graph, because I just point to the white tall bar. This is data from independent observers are giving those interrogations that I just mentioned that were collected in that study, and they're given and they're asked to determine how much effort they see on the part of the interrogator to elicit a confession, okay? And so the higher the bar, the more effort. That bar there is the condition in which the suspects were innocent, but the investigators believed them to be guilty. So this is that bar is significantly different than the other conditions, right? More effort. And so what we think is going on, that the more effort, they believe that the person is guilty, but in fact the person is innocent, they try to use more tactics to get that confession. And as this is happening, the innocent person is denying, right? Trying to explain their situation. But in fact, so this combination leads to greater effort, and this is what can lead to a process to getting a false confession. Okay, other studies look specifically at the tactics, and we see that the minimization tactic, and why that is important, the minimization tactic is important for us for psychologists, is because a lot of these tactics carry a message of leniency. In reducing the seriousness, in trying to reduce the seriousness of an offense, some of these tactics suggest leniency. And leniency is one thing that can be considered to reject the confession as involuntary. And so officers are not supposed to promise any kind of leniency in exchange for a confession or threaten the suspect in exchange for a confession. What we find is that when we see, when this tactic is used, with this minimization tactic that implies messages of leniency compared to an explicit deal, we find that both of these tactics increase the rate of true confessions, as you can see on the left bar. We get an increase of true confessions as compared to a control group, but it also increases the false confession rate. And it actually is dangerous because it doubles and triples the rate of false confessions. So you see that arrow, right? So why these tactics are used is because they do elicit true confessions, right? They're very powerful. The problem is that they also elicit false confessions, and not at the same rate. They're exponentially more likely to occur the more of the tactics that you use. Same thing with the false evidence ploy. Whether it's a false evidence that is presented to the suspect or whether it's a bluff that there's going to be evidence. Either way, the false confession rate increases as compared to control groups. I'm not going to talk about suspect vulnerabilities because I don't have time, but I do want to end with a more positive note and say that psychological science, together with law enforcement now in the U.S., are starting to develop scientifically based approaches to improve the quality of information that is obtained from suspects and reduce the chances of obtaining false confessions. And these approaches involve information gathering activities, rapport building with the suspect, using strategic questions that are helpful to elicit information if the person has the information in memory, right? But make it difficult for the liar. A strategic use of evidence, of true evidence, real evidence, not false evidence, in a supportive environment. I mean, little things like a supportive environment makes a huge difference in what you elicit from suspects. And this research is based on lots of psychological research, but also from based on other approaches that are proven to be successful in other countries, like in the UK. Just quickly, I know I have just a few seconds, but I think this is the coolest graph of all the things that I show you because this is the positive part. When we're looking at the effectiveness of these approaches, there are now summaries of this research, and these bars indicate, the more effectiveness, right? The higher the bar, the more effectiveness. And so when you compare, this is on the left, there's three graphs, right? So the left graph, when you compare accusatory approaches to a control group, what you find is that the accusatory approach it's effective at in eliciting true confessions, but also false confessions. And in this particular graph, actually, more false confessions than true confessions, but both types of confessions increases, right? When you compare an information gathering approach to a control group, the information gathering approach is more effective at eliciting true confessions, not false confessions. And when you compare an information gathering approach to an accusatory approach, the information gathering approach wins, right? It is more effective at inducing true confessions than false confessions. So there's really nice scientific based. It's a really nice scientific based approach. Now, let me just say that we're moving in a positive direction. The United Nations now considering universal standards for how to interview suspects. So this is at the level of the United Nations, and they are recommending standards based on these information gathering approaches. And more locally, the LAPD, and I think is Robbery and Homicide Division, they are also collaborating with scientists in trying to test these approaches in the field. Yeah, I got it. And so that's exciting because in this country it's very difficult to work with law enforcement. I'm jealous of my colleagues in Europe who actually work with law enforcement, and they, in collaboration, they develop good research. But in this country it's very difficult to do so. So this is exciting that we see a collaboration, but that's what we need. So if you're interested, you can look at this article in Wired Magazine, which is a top-notch publication, and is an article about the LAPD working with researchers to use these new approaches, and they found it to be effective. So that's the positive note of this talk. Thank you.